Okay. Are we live now?
Okay,
welcome everybody. Welcome everyone to the Audit and Corporate Governance meeting. Are there any apologies, please? Councillor Hart,
yes,
wasn't it?
Chair, we have apologies from Councillor Hart. That's right, Chair. Just Councillor Hart.
Code of conduct, any declarations of interest, please?
Yes, Mayor Chair, it's Councillor Keane. I'd like some advice essentially, but I think I would like to declare an interest in agenda items 4 and 5. Number 4, if necessary, because Cheshire Police is mentioned as a preset raising body that is impacted by the figures. So, if necessary, I would declare an interest and perhaps with your advice, Chair, not take part in a vote on the matter or discussion. And also the potential of agenda item 5 with Cheshire Police or the PCC owning much estate in Cheshire that would be subject to national non-domestic rates. I wonder whether I should maybe just to be on the safe side declare an interest and perhaps not take part in that item, if that's agreeable, Chair.
That's fine. Thanks, David, for that.
Thank you, Chairman.
Okay. No other declarations. Then we'll go on to the minutes, the previous. Happy to confirm those?
Yes, happy to confirm.
Yep. Okay, thanks. We'll then go on to to item 4, council tax base. We need to approve the figures. Who's going to lead on this, please?
That'll be me, Chair.
Okay.
Regular report that you receive each year where we've gone through and estimated the number of the equivalent of Band D properties across the whole of Warrington, which is required as part of the formal budget setting process. The numbers, as in the last few years, have increased very slightly due to the number of properties within the town. But other than that, there's very little difference than in previous years.
Okay. Are there any comments or questions on the figures? Self-explanatory. So we're happy to agree the council tax base.
Could I just question, is in 8.4 the calculation?
Yeah.
Do you actually round the figures up in each of these? I think there's a slight difference between the figures in 8.4 and what they should be.
They probably have been rounded up.
That's okay. That does explain it then. Thank you.
What I can say, we can make sure they have been rounded to make sure when they come forward to full council, if there is an issue.
Okay.
Okay, so subject to them being double checked. Are we happy to approve the base?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
We'll go on then to item 5.
Thank you, Chair. So item 5 is around the national non-domestic rates forecast, similarly used as part of the budget process, although clearly can have a less of an impact because we keep such a smaller proportion of our business rates. But again, this is the form and the detail that we have to return each year. I think a couple of things I'd point out, that we're continuing to pool our business rates. The intention is to carry on doing that with Halton and St Helens. That does help us keep a small extra percentage across the 3 authorities that we wouldn't otherwise get to keep. As Councillor Keane mentioned, it does have a minor impact onto police. I don't think it probably was an issue for in terms of the way he raised it. And obviously all businesses have to pay business rates unless the government gives them other exemptions anyway. So, but here, the papers are here as previously to delegate for me to complete the to authorise that form for completion to MHCLG.
Okay, thanks for that. Are there any comments or questions, please? Okay, we're happy to agree to delegation to the director and the cabinet member responsible.
Yes.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay, right, thanks for that. Item 6, commercial capital governance and Price Waterhouse action plan. We've had a very comprehensive report and action plan from Price Waterhouse. I take it everyone's read it. We can either go through it page by page, or you can just raise issues as you see fit. How do you want to proceed?
I'm happy to present part of the report or the covering report if you want me to do that, Chair, and just point out some of the issues from this.
Thanks, Jean. Do you want to do that now, please?
You. Yes, please. So the report is, as you say, it's the action plan from the independent commercial governance review that PwC did. And also with this report, we've put the Local Government Association review, which was carried out as a supplementary review to the peer review that was carried out in March 2019. We've collated all the output to just pull together all the improved governance arrangements that we're now working through. So the LGA review, we note there at paragraph 3.3, the council asked the LGA review team specifically to review the council's commercial activities, but they didn't do that at the time. And what they did, the council invited them to conduct a more detailed financial review after that peer review. So this is the report from that that's attached to Appendix 2. And that was issued, well, COVID hit in 2020, so there has been a little bit of a delay on that. But what we've done now is we've reflected all the recommendations in there and tied them into the PwC action plan as well. So just a conclusion at 3.5, PwC concluded that the governance framework's in line with good practice and there's a clear understanding of skills requirements, external advisors are appropriately used and so on. And then at 3.6, they also noted the improvements that have been made over the years and then noted that how that, as it became more embedded, would further improve governance arrangements. I've pointed out the internal audit reviews that have been done over the past few years as well, because we followed this journey of from the capital programme and the big capital projects right through to the more complex reviews that we see now. And we have recognised that in the annual reports from internal audit as well. And again, we've cross-referenced any of the internal audit reports and findings into the PwC action plan. We've also cross-referenced recent public interest reports that Grant Thornton have issued because we wanted to make sure anything raised in those, if there's anything that crosses over with the action plan, we're taking that into account. So we've also included any cross-reference to those. So it's really to pull everything together to make sure that we've got everything in that action plan. And now there's a working group that's working through all of those actions. And what the working group's done at 4.2, just to bring to your attention, we've taken out what we think are the really high risk areas. And there are three main headings there: how the council manages the commercial governance arrangements, including all the subsidiary companies, how we make sure the reporting is clear, so making sure that's all clear for all the decision making that's taken, and also looking at the training programme, membership of boards and so on, and making sure the relevant training and expertise is there. So that's the main issues out of that report. We, as I say, they're meeting regularly to look at the actions that are needed, and we've got senior leadership team looking at this on a regular basis to make sure the action is undertaken. And then the full action plans are at the back of this.
Okay. Are there any comments on the report or the action plan?
Yes, Chairman.
Yes, Ian.
Okay, thank you. Yes, 2 or 3 questions. The first question, why has it taken so long for the LGA follow-up report to come to us? Because it says issued July 2019, which is a long while ago now. So that's my first question. The other one on the reports, I mean, we've seen the PwC action plan, which is certainly very comprehensive. But what about why haven't we actually got a copy of the original PwC report, or unless it's all contained in the action plan? But I assume it isn't from what Jean has just said. So that's my first pair of questions. The second one, if you look on page 38 and 39, it talks about at R20 and R21 reviewing sort of board membership of the two of the sort of the things which are fairly high profile, which is Redwood Bank and Together Energy. So I'd just like, and I know this is in the action plan, but I'd just like to know a little bit about the thinking, because it talks about independent people there. So I'm just wondering what the initial thinking is on that. My final question on page 45 of our report is, it talks about the reserves, and it's quite damning about the low level of Warrington's reserves, which came as a little bit of a surprise to me. But I thought we had reasonable reserves, but it is quite damning. I think there's something about the way we report them which is not quite normal as well. So again, I'd sort of like comment on that too, please.
I'm happy to take all of those, Chair, if that's helpful. I think I'll try and take them in the order that you asked them, Councillor Marks. And if I've noted them down slightly wrong, if you want to correct me as I go along. In terms of the delay on the LGA report, the draft report was completed, as you say. However, we hadn't agreed the final report at that stage. There were a number of errors in the original report. We gave our comments back to the LGA and corrected a number of those errors. That required a little bit of going to and fro both the council and the LGA, and they issued us what was then their second version of the draft it was February 2020. I think we should probably have done something quicker on it at that point. However, at that point, it wasn't long after that I think we were all hands to the pump in terms of dealing with COVID, which is why it then got left for a few months before we came back and revisited it. Something, and included within that, the action of getting PwC to do their work was kind of one of the actions the LGA had recommended. So we ended up putting the two things together in order that we could have that and bring it back as one report here. Actually, Danny might want to correct me on this, or Jean, but on the actual action plan, the report from PwC, my understanding is that initially PwC hadn't wanted to put their full report into the public domain, which is why they did a full presentation to members of the committee as a separate presentation before the last meeting. But I think there was an issue over why they didn't want us to put the whole report into the public domain. From my perspective, I would be quite happy to share that report with members of the committee. I just don't think they wanted us to actually report it, but we might just need to go back and check on that item.
Yeah, I think you're actually correct on that, Linton. And the reason they didn't want it going into the public domain, there's a lot of work went into that report, and what they obviously want to do is do this report for the councils. And if it went into the public domain, theoretically, other councils could just copy the methodology. But
barring anything within their terms of reference, I can't see why we can't share that with all members of this committee. Just not as a public document. In terms of those two key recommendations around the governance and the board makeup of both Redwood and Together Energy, they are two key things. I'll take them separately though. In terms of Redwood Bank, when we invested into the bank at the time of a newly formed bank, on the best advice, it was probably right to go ahead without the council having representation on the board. Because of the conflicts between, if we put somebody on the board, if I take myself, I can't be on the board of the bank, although I am a shareholder observer. If I'm on the board, I'd be conflicted in my role as the council's Section 151 officer. Anybody that we put onto the board of the bank, their first duty is to act for the bank and not directly to the council. And there is therefore that kind of a risk if we put somebody on. I think, though, it's becoming apparent as the bank is growing, as the bank is now starting to approach towards being 4 years old, it's probably getting to a point where it may well worth, as it grows and becomes more complex, for the council to reconsider whether we do put somebody onto that board to look after the council's best interests, rather than it being just me as an observer. And that's something I think we probably do need to consider, and I think was delegated to myself and to Matthew Cumberbatch to keep that under review, so we could make that appointment. We also had within the original contract with the bank, under our shareholder agreement, we have the right to appoint a board member at any time. So it's just a matter of, if we do that, we need to find the right person. As clearly it's quite a a detailed skill set to be able to sit on the board of a bank, including needing to be PRA approved through the Bank of England. In terms of Together Energy Limited, it perhaps is starting now, that's now getting to a point where we have only put the one person on the board, which is currently the chief executive. He actually has the vote of 3 people because we have got 3 places on that board. And myself and Matt Cumberbatch have been considering who else we put onto that board. And I think that, again, where we're at, it's been difficult perhaps during the last year to put somebody onto the board in quite the same way. But I think, again, that's something we need to do quite shortly, hence why it's on the action plan, so that we can take up our other 2 places on the board of the energy company. Alongside that, also ensuring that the board of the energy companies proceeds in putting other independent board members on there, so that we start to get further expertise across the energy sector. And the final one, I think, was on low level of reserves. I guess maybe it's not something we didn't quite pick out in the covering report on the LGA report. I don't actually, it's one of the things that I don't agree with the LGA report on. And in fact, as part of the budget process this year, we've been doing a fundamental review of all of our reserves. We don't have a low level of reserves. We haven't got a huge level of reserves, but compared to lots of councils, actually, we've got quite good reserves. The issue that the LGA picked up, and I don't think is properly reflected in their report, is they commented on how we treat, I think it was they picked up on what they called the general fund reserve. Now in Warrington, we've got 3 funds that technically could count as being the general fund reserve. We have our general fund reserve, we have a strategic reserve, which I've always described as being our safety net and fallback, but we've also had the MTFP reserve, which most councils don't have. But from an accounting point of view, all 3 of those reserves are really the same thing. So if you wanted to compare us with another local authority, it would normally be the figure that others would put in their general reserve. You'd need to include all 3 of our reserves in that analysis. We've changed since this was picked up by the LGA. We've changed the way we're putting our figures into the annual return, so that when it goes back as part of the SITFA stats or part of the revenue outturn report, it's quite clear to anybody looking externally what figure they are comparing like for like between Warrington and other local authorities. I think that was all of the questions, Councillor.
Yeah, no, thank you, Lyndon. Yes, I mean, I certainly sort of welcome your talk about sort of these independent board members. I think the sooner that can be done, the better, because as I say, this is, as we well know, very controversial issues these, and having an independent person there can only be helpful, as I thought, to all parties involved. So I hope that can happen sooner rather than later. Okay, thank you for the response, Lyndon.
You're on mute, Chair.
Yeah, I was just asking Ian if he was volunteering to go on the board.
He's not got the record. Chair, it's Steve Parish. Obviously, I'm a board member on the transport board, but and I've got qualifications in transport. But obviously, to be a member of a banking board is another matter entirely. Just wanted to query what the status of that role would be, because Ian said an independent member, but of course Linton said, you know, your first duty as a shareholder, as a director, is to the bank, but technically to the shareholders, which includes Warrington Borough Council, and the same with Together Energy. Are there any shareholders other than the council?
Yeah, in terms of the bank, it would be, and the bank have already got independent non-exec directors appointed to the bank. I guess what we were talking about is whether Warrington will want to appoint a separate independent non-exec that was there partly to, well, it's difficult. They aren't there really to look after the shareholder, although they are overall. But really they are there to look after the interests of the bank. I think what we'd be looking for is somebody that was coming from a Warrington perspective and they're therefore able to look after our interests in some way if we did that. So I missed the other question. Sorry, Councillor.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm saying is
other shareholders in terms of Together Energy.
Yeah, well, what is the duty of shareholders on any company who's the underlying it? And again, in Together Energy, other shareholders, I can't remember other shareholders other than the council.
Yes, they are. The council's a 50% shareholder, okay. And the other shareholder was the original owner of the company, Paul Richards, the majority shareholder, who is the managing director of the company as well. Okay. And
how's it doing?
Together Energy is doing very well. Yes. We're pulling together at the moment a report that's going on to the next cabinet meeting that has an update on the majority of our large investments and showing how well they are doing at the moment.
Okay. I have a query which I don't expect a detailed answer to. On page 34, R10 talks of key decision limits to be reviewed.
Yeah.
Would that be reviewed upwards or downwards?
It was actually a note by PwC that our key decision limit is actually quite low compared to a number of other local authorities.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So it was really
there'll be a report on that at the February meeting.
I think that's down as Matt and Adam to review it, but it was just whether or not, and that probably needs to go through either this committee or through Constitutional Subcommittee, whether we would want to raise it. Yeah. I know we did look at it as a council probably 7 or 8 years ago. We decided at that point it was right. Even then, when we reviewed it, I don't think even if we raised it up very slightly in line with some of the other local authorities, even if you raised it to £500,000, it probably doesn't bring many more decisions out of what are already going to cabinet. But it was just to keep it under review. Given
well,
that
the report says we consider reviewing it, so we'll consider it on the February meeting.
Okay.
And then it'll be job done either way, won't it? We can tick that one off. Are there any other comments or reports on Price Waterhouse's recommendations?
I could ask a question, please, Chair. Just it is related, and it's related to the governance, I suppose. So Warrington have been mentioned in a national journal or a magazine in the last couple of issues of it, and I was just wondering whether or not the Price Waterhouse Cooper review would reassure us as a committee that and Warrington taxpayers that the governance that is in place regarding the council's investment strategy and also its accounts are appropriate.
Yeah, I think if you do see the entire review, which, as I say, I've got no problem with sharing with the committee, I think it will give you some of that extra reassurance that you're looking for.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, just going back to publishing that report, if we publish it now, would Price Waterhouse have any problem with that, because it's what, 18 months old? So the methodology that's contained therein is out of date. Well, it's old hat by now, surely. They couldn't.
No, the Price Waterhouse isn't 18 months old. It's only a few months old. They only completed the work November, December time. Yeah, so, which is why I'm happy to share it. But I don't think under the terms of the contract we had with them we can share it publicly, because they would want to be using that with other local authorities rather than other local authorities trying to.
Then, if you're sharing the report with members, it will be on a private basis, not on an agenda item.
Yes.
I think it's worth reiterating, Chair, what the conclusion of the report was, and primarily to answer the previous question. You know, various articles are appearing in Private Eye and other publications that are not true. Overall, this is actually in the report, I'll read the quote out to you, PricewaterhouseCoopers' conclusion on the council's governance framework was a framework for governance is in place, and the strategy and the strategic direction of the council is clearly defined and understood by members and officers. So that primarily was the overall conclusion of the report.
Okay.
Maybe we can go back to PwC to see if there's any issue with them if we do make it public, because I get where you're coming from, Councillor, because if that can help give not just reassurance to members, but the public could get some of that reassurance, it would be helpful too.
Yes,
I agree. I think there is obviously a huge amount of concern, and it goes beyond Private Eye, but locally there's a huge amount of concern that has been voiced in a number of different mediums, that the council are investing inappropriately, and also that the debt that the council have is not manageable. So if that could be shared with us, I think, and also with the Warrington public, I think that would be very, very useful to try and allay some of the concerns that people have.
Chair, if I can just add, if that's okay. Clearly, with the council, it is subject to Freedom of Information Act requirements, so any work PwC do is subject to that requirement, and therefore they should be able to provide, at the very least, a redacted report that goes into the public domain.
okay. Anyway, have a chat with them, see what they want to do, but either way, it'll be published to members.
Yes.
Okay, thanks for that, Andrew. Are we okay now with this item? Any more on this one?
Yes, it is, Chairman.
Yeah.
Can I just come back with one other point?
Yes.
We're talking about sort of magazines and what's in the public domain. I mean, there was something on in the CIPFA magazine recently, in the context of the sort of the PWLB changing their rates, and I quote from it: "The announcement of the new rate," that's by PWLB, "led to the UK Municipal Bonds Agency abandoning a planned 8-year sterling issuance with Warrington Borough Council in the midst of its marketing to potential investors." Now, I just wondered what implications this has for what we're doing or what we want to do in the future, because I think when I questioned the PWLB rate change at the last meeting, I think the Municipal Bond Agency was seen as an alternative way of doing it, but I was concerned at the time that was against the spirit of what the government, rightly or wrongly, wanted us to do. So just, interested to know what the comment on that is, please.
Yeah, thanks, you, Councillor. I think in terms of the wording of how that was released, it was perhaps slightly unfortunate. It was actually Warrington ourselves that pulled the plug on that issue. We decided, having spent a week talking to a number of city institutions and looking for them to give us offers around that bond that we were potentially going to do, it became quite clear from a financial value for money point of view, there was no benefit in going with the Municipal Bonds Agency any longer. The PWLB, that drop in rate that came through, means that the things that we have in line within our existing capital programme, we will continue to check whether it's right, but at the moment it appears that PWLB is the cheaper form of us being able to carry on with our capital programme. There are some changes within the rules around PWLB, particularly the not investing into property purely for yield and not outside of our economic area. And at the moment, we have no plans to invest into property purely for yield outside of our economic area. So that doesn't prevent us proceeding with what we're expecting to do with PWLB borrowing. And the drop in interest rate means that there's extra savings potentially available on some of the schemes that we're looking at that are much nearer, or perhaps related to some of the renewable energy schemes that we're looking at, that will produce a better return for the council, as well as helping meet some of those other policy objectives such as housing or climate change that we're trying so much to do towards.
Okay, yeah, no, thank you for that, Linton. I'm pleased to sort of detect a definite change of emphasis in what we're trying to do with this money in the future. So that's good and right. I'm sure the public, it'll go down well with the public as well. Thank you.
Any more on that? Okay, we're happy to note the recommendations. Take that as a yes. Item 7, Officer Governance Group.
Thank you, Chair. I'll take this report. It just briefs committee on the work undertaken by the Officer Governance Group during the year so far. And it also provides some assurance around how the governance arrangements have been amended and applied and how service provisions continue to be managed during the pandemic. So I've noted at section 4, there have been quite a lot of meetings so far during the year. And I think the group's view here was they wanted some regular updates and assurance around the impact of the pandemic on the council's governance arrangements. We've talked about the group look at the improvement action plan from the annual governance statement over the last year, and we get updates on a regular basis on that action plan. Obviously, one of the key areas is around the pandemic, so I've just put a paragraph there at 5.2. And then at 5.3, as I noted, the group did want some extra assurance around how things have been amended, how things then go back to normal governance arrangements and so on. So what the group decided to do was ask all of the directorates to complete an adapted form of the self-assessment exercise that's done on an annual basis. And we amended that to ask specific questions around response to the pandemic. That was taken back through each directorate management team and then returned through and discussed at the governance group and also at senior leadership team. So we've got some quite strong evidence there for the base of the assurance framework for 2021. And looking obviously at the current lockdown and the continuation of that, those amended arrangements obviously continue to be in place. Another key area around that at 5.4 is obviously disaster recovery and business continuity and the way the council's been able to maintain its business during the pandemic. So there's been assurance around plans for business continuity and that critical services, can carry on as part of this. I think the other thing to draw your attention to then, there's information there against each of the areas in the AGS. I think the only other thing to draw your attention to is that is an ongoing process. We've got another meeting scheduled in a couple of weeks' time. We've also got some work going on around governance structures in the council. So there is a lot of work underway this year by this group to provide assurance through to yourselves. Happy to take any questions.
Okay, thanks, Jean. Are there any comments or questions, please?
Could I ask a general question, 5.6, regarding the annual accounts and where they're up to with Grant Thornton and what progress you're making?
Chair, do you want me to answer that question? I appreciate we've got the next item is for external audit, so.
Yeah.
Do you want to leave it till next item?
Okay, yeah, I'll answer your question on the next item.
Thank you.
Any others? Okay, well, thanks for that. And the next item is strategic risk management.
Yes, thanks, Chair. I'll take the report on risk management. It shows you the risk management and insurance activity for the first 6 months of this financial year. At 4.1, we've noted there that you've also got the strategic risk register attached to this report at Appendix 1, and you've got a summary there in Figure 1 as a standard report that comes to you to show movement on risks and so on. At 4.3, we've pointed out that the significant risks continue to be those areas reported there. I think these come to you each time. I think that these major risks sort of don't really change at this strategic level. And then some paragraphs underneath this, just to pull out some of the issues around some of the risks in the risk register. So I've noted at paragraph 4.6 with regard to pandemic, during Q1, we were looking potentially at reducing the impact rating. It was reduced down to 4, but obviously with lockdown 2 coming along and obviously the continued winter issues, that's gone up again, and it's been increased again to a 25, that one. 4.7, the risk of cyber attack still remains really significant. obviously now so reliant on technology that allows everyone, most people to work from home and meetings to go ahead. So the training is really critical. ICT of following up on the mandatory training that's been rolled out for both officers and members there, and making sure all business critical systems would carry on services if they did have an attack, if they didn't have access to those systems, to really think that through. At 4.10, we've kept on the risk around corporate governance, such a huge area and such a lot going on with the pandemic and the changes that are coming through with Brexit. Lots of different legislation that has to be kept on top of. So that stays as a high risk on there. At 4.11, we've looked at the definition for strategic risk 24, which is around management of all the strategic investment portfolio, and making sure the monitoring and the governance arrangements are in place. At 4.13, we've just noted that there are 2 new risks that have come onto the risk register during Q2. Strategic risk 25 is specifically around the council's leisure, library and lifestyle provider, and 26 is around the challenges with maintaining the statutory provision of services for children with the EHC plans in place, especially where those children are required to isolate. At 4.14, we recognise the new corporate strategy, so there will be work to look at potential further risks attached to the objectives, and that is a piece of work that will need to be done during this next year. And then at 4.15, I just wanted to point out the risks around delivering health inequalities. We have that on the strategic risk register split out across the directorates, and we are looking at how that is reported, that risk. And also we've still got the internal audit report in draft, so trying to pull everything together there and really think through the risks attached to that. But obviously there's a lot of other work that's taking up the attention of our public health colleagues. And just the other thing is 4.19 about health and safety, and there have been some concerns raised around the increasing risks around the capacity for officers to manage the health and safety responsibilities in line with everything else to do with the pandemic, and that's particularly acute in adult social care. And just overall at 4.20 is the whole impact on workforce, and obviously as we go into this lockdown at this time of year, a huge impact on the workforce, as we know. Lots of additional risks around responding to the pandemic, continued response to the revised arrangements under Brexit. So the whole impact for workforce is huge, and it's a huge risk. The insurance activity at section 5 gives you the insurance claims activity for the first 6 months of the year, and you've got the table there at figure 3. We had 214 claims closed during the first 6 months, and then we've just given you a summary there of the new claims that have been reported in the first 6 months. And at 5.6, we've just noted that there was a real hike in school travel related claims during the first 6 months, because obviously there are a lot of cancelled trips, but we've not really seen any other real noticeable changes to the typical pattern of claim activity, which probably is a bit unusual really when we think about the 6 month period. And section 6, we've just put a paragraph around new and emerging issues. Obviously, as I say, continued significant financial impact of COVID-19 and what that will mean for budget setting over the next year, and obviously for the media, and then obviously the risks attached to Brexit as well. I'll keep coming back to the same key issues really. Happy to take any questions, Chair.
Thanks, Gina. Are there any comments or questions?
Please. Was the travel arrangements around the same time that we changed the policy for children with special needs not being taxed from 16 to 18 years?
I think paragraph 5.6 is talking about specific sort of trips that were sold, where they wouldn't give us a contractual refund. I think there was quite a lot of argument going on there about the reasons for cancel.
That's fine. I just know that there was issues with children with special needs taxes being stopped. It was it was an issue for a lot of us as councillors with complaints, but I thought maybe that was linked to it. Sorry if it wasn't.
Okay. For 3 recommendations, are you happy to adopt them? And again, I'll take that as a yes. Okay.
Was my previous question, sorry, Chair, was my previous question going to be answered in this section? So it might be worth hearing from the, excuse me, the council's thoughts on the governance and risk relating to its investments.
Danny, is Danny there?
And the work of the annual accounts was relating to the question previously.
Sorry, yeah. Sorry, what was the question? Are we dealing with the question on the annual accounts, the council's point of view?
Yeah. Well, I asked the question previously, and I was wondering what the, in light of the risks that we've just discussed, where the annual accounts sit, and in light of the financial position, and if you have a thought on the accounts.
Chair,
do you want me to answer that, Winton, or do you want to do it?
No, I think I'll try and pick it up first of all, Danny. I was struggling to follow the question in light of the context of this report, Councillor. So, but I just suddenly then remembered that you'd asked it in light of a previous report.
Yeah, and it was going to be answered in this section. I understood.
Yeah, and I think I'd confused myself that when Chair said we'd pick it up later, it was going to be under the external auditors update.
Sorry,
that's what I meant.
Right, sorry.
I guess from my point of view on the external audit, we do still have issues with the 2017-18 accounts. There are probably 3 or 4 outstanding issues relating to that. So although we've got the objection resolved, we still have an outstanding issue relating to how the council represents our valuation of our investment into Redwood Bank. We have attempted a couple of ways of dealing with that, neither of which so far had been agreed by Grant Thornton. I've agreed part of a way forward with Grant Thornton just before Christmas, and we've got a call with Grant Thornton, including PwC from their banking division are now assisting us on that piece of work, and we've got a call with them. I think, Andrew, it's early next week.
Yeah, next Tuesday.
Yeah, and we hope from that we can then agree between our advisors in PwC and Grant Thornton's banking specialists exactly how we need to value the bank into our accounts. I personally still don't think it's going to be materially different, because at that stage of the investment it was a much smaller investment, but I think we need to await the outcome of that piece of work, which PwC think they can turn around quite quickly once they know exactly what it is they're being asked to do. We do still have a couple of other issues. I think particularly, I know unfortunately within Andy's team, he's not had all of his team here all of the time. That's delayed some work around plant and equipment, which is now being looked at by some external advisors for Grant Thornton. And we still have an issue. It's not just an issue for Warrington, it's actually an issue across all of the Cheshire authorities with pension fund, and some figures that the pension fund have supplied to us, which I think between us, the pension fund, Grant Thornton, we still haven't quite got to the bottom of what the error is there, but it's affected not just us, but the other Cheshire authorities as well. I think off the top of my head, that's probably the issues that are left outstanding, which does mean that if we can complete those and give that information as necessary, that we're probably not that far off, and hopefully that Andrew would agree with me that we're not that far off agreeing the 2017-18 accounts.
Thank you.
Chair, do you want me to add that?
I can't hear anyone.
We can hear you, and Andrew asked if he could add to it, Chair.
Right, yeah, okay, I didn't hear him say that.
Thanks, Chair. So yeah, I mean, I'd agree with Linton's assessment of where the audits are. We have there were issues with 17-18 audit in the passage of time had aged the audit somewhat, so we are having to do some additional work around the valuation of land and buildings. We've had to go through the file to update audit evidence, given that there will be more audit evidence to obtain, given that time has passed significantly. So we've had to do that. And the other issue, which I may have mentioned in the past, is the fact that I've taken over from Robin due to his long-term absence has led to more review points. The good news is that we have largely done, if you like, the update of audit evidence, and we've addressed most of those review points. But as Linton did indicate, there are a few technical issues that we're still trying to get to the bottom of. I wouldn't want to put a time scale on things because I've made that mistake in the past, but substantially the audit is complete. It is these technical issues that need to be resolved, and at that, once we get to that stage, we should be able to move fairly swiftly towards completion. But I guess what I can't do is put a timescale on how long it will take to resolve some of these technical issues. The pension one is probably the best example of that, in that we need the information, and it's not just us, the council are struggling to get that information together to quantify the size of the issue. So the audit will take as long as it takes in order to do it to sufficient quality, but Linton is right, it is largely just some technical issues that we need to resolve.
Thank you.
Okay. We'll move on to the next report. External Auditors Progress Report. That's you, Andrew, please.
Thanks, Chair. I mean, to be honest, I've probably updated members just then in terms of the 17-18 audit. Of course, we have got the 18-19 audit on the go too, albeit what we've decided, agreed with Linton, is that we'll try to concentrate on 17-18, get that signed off, and then move on to the 18-19 audit. As I've previously indicated, there is less to do to get the 18-19 audit from where it is now to completion. The only complicating factor in that is the fact that we do have an 18-19 objection, which we still need to conclude upon. Again, that relates to Redwood Bank. There is still some information that we need in order to complete that review. That information largely sits with the bank, and I have spoken to the bank in regards to that. I had hoped to get some of that information, or it had been promised before Christmas. I've not yet received that, and we'll be chasing up the bank to try and get hold of that information. The complicating factor around that, the reason why I mention it, is obviously we do need to conclude that objection before we can actually conclude the accounts. And as you know from previous experience, there's obviously process that needs to be go through in time. Obviously, it does take an element of time to get through that process. So that might complicate things on 18-19. But the good news is there is less work to do in order to conclude the audit. The only real outstanding technical issue relating to 18-19 relates to IFRS 9, where we have had some quite long conversation with the finance team around the accounting and disclosures around that, and we're not quite to the bottom of that, but hopefully we can resolve that one fairly quickly.
Would the differences of opinion about MRP affect signing off of the accounts, or is that for a future discussion?
That is less relevant for 17-18 because the guidance didn't come into play until the 1st of April 2019. However, it will complicate the 18-19 audit because it does have consequences for our VFM conclusion.
Okay, so I think the committee will want to report on the whys and wherefores of MRP probably for February or March. Committee.
Yeah, but we've had But we've actually got training, Chair, with this coming up. We've got member training. You all should have received an invite. So we brought probably the best qualified expert in the land to come and give member training to you. There's 2 sessions organised for members on the 16th of February, one at 2 o'clock and one at 6 o'clock in the evening. So that should give you about all the information you need on MRP, and hopefully it should be timely as well, with council agreeing the MRP policy in March.
Then we'll have it for the March meeting. Can you advise whoever's doing the training that the committee will be very interested in MRP?
We certainly can.
And sure, Chair, he's already been advised that that's the reason we're doing the training. So
yeah. Okay then. Anything else on Andrew's report?
Yes, please, Chairman.
Yeah, go on, Ian.
Yeah, I mean, clearly, one of there's several issues around is this difference of view about sort of the valuation of Redwood Bank. Now, obviously, what we seem to be doing, we're using PwC as our advisor, which is obviously going to cost us sort of more money. And I don't know whether this is a negotiation. I don't know how. Obviously, I don't really understand the issue. But how important is this? If say the council conceded this and said, OK, Grant Thornton, you're right on this, what's the downside for us, apart from a sort of a matter of principle that we don't want to be, demonstrated perhaps we've done something wrong in the past? But it seems to me it's one of the key things that's holding us up, and it's costing money. And I don't exactly know for what purpose we're having this sort of debate, discussion, negotiation, whatever you want to call it. So it's a question both for Linton and Andrew, really.
Linton, do you want me to go first on that to give the audit view? So I think the difficult we have
to go first, because it's the question I asked you, I think, a few months ago, Andy.
Yeah, absolutely. So the issue we have is that we do not know whether this issue is material or not to the council's account. So the question that we are posing to the council is, you should do an assessment of the valuation of the options that the council had in the bank and prove to us that it's not material and that you don't need to account for it. At the moment, we don't have that assessment and that evidence. So without it, there's only really kind of 2 things that we can, there's only one other route that we can do, which would be effectively to get my own experts in to do a bank valuation and then value the options. If they came back and said this is material, but then the council refused to do anything about it, I would have no option but to qualify the council's accounts on this particular matter. Alternatively, the council could at that point decide to then appoint its own expert to then get its own independent valuation and do it, which effectively is what it's doing now. So ultimately, really, there's only really 2 options, unfortunately, for the council, because it needs to provide us with the evidence around this, is to get its own expert to do the valuation, or it's to potentially get potentially it could be getting a qualified accountant. The only other real circumstance where that we could get around this is obviously we get our experts in and they declare it not material, but that isn't typically what we would do as auditors, because the onus really is upon the authority, because it's their accounts to prepare the accounts and provide the assessment of the estimates that go into that. And unfortunately, on this particular one, we don't have the evidence to conclude that it's not material. So hopefully, it is quite a complex matter and quite complex accounting, but hopefully I've at least tried to explain that in layman terms what this means from an audit point of view. Hope that answers your question.
Okay, thanks. Well, I'm interested in Linton's views about why this is perhaps so important to us, and if we conceded a thing, and I'm not suggesting we should necessarily do that, what are the implications? I mean, we get the audit done rather more quickly, but what's the downside for the council if we said, OK, we've got this wrong?
There isn't a downside. I think we took the way we valued it initially was at what we'd invested into it, and there's been an issue over what was left to invest and how you value the difference between what we had invested and what we plan to invest at later stages. So actually in the later years, it's not even an issue, because by then we've invested the full 30 million. The issue is over the valuation between the 10 million and still the opportunity to invest the further 20 million at that stage. So it's only an issue in the 2017-18 accounts. I guess, and this is, however I say this, it sounds kind of critical in one way or another. I think it wasn't helped because of the objection on Redwood Bank, which delayed other issues linked to Redwood. So this item got kind of pushed further and further back. And that meant it was probably quite late on that we even realised that there was this as an issue. At which point, and that maybe what we should have done at that point, which is probably now 12 months ago, is gone straight to PwC ourselves and asked for them to be able to provide the independent view in order to be able to submit that. Either way, I think that works out cheaper for the council to get PwC to do it than in effect for Grant Thornton to do something on our behalf, which Andy would have to then pick up a cost for outside of the council's control, and it would come back as a cost as part of our audit. So I'd rather we were in control and did it through our own framework in terms of the price that PwC are doing it for us.
Okay, thank you.
Would it be fair to summarise this, that Price Waterhouse are undertaking an independent review, whatever their decision, both sides will abide by their conclusion?
No, Grant Thornton still need to assess what PwC come back with, but at least I'm then happier standing behind that I've got an expert telling me what exactly the way that we should do it.
Well, put it this way, suppose Price Waterhouse said that Grant Thornton are right. I'm sure Grant Thornton would agree with it. The question is, would we?
Ultimately, we would be asking them to do an evaluation, essentially, is what we're. Once we receive that valuation, my expert within GT will be looking at that, look at the approach taken, which we are agreeing up front. So hopefully we can get that sorted before they PwC start work. But in terms of the actual valuation, my expert will review that and make sure he's happy with that. So it will not be just simply a case of agreeing with whatever answer PwC come up with. My own valuer will be looking at it independently and providing me advice on whether they agree that the valuation is reasonable. So to be honest, I have no particular view on what the answer should be. So I don't think there'll ever be a case of I agree or disagree with PwC, but I will obviously be relying upon my own expert to get a view on that.
Cheers. So again, for clarification, Price Waterhouse are not acting in the role of arbitrator.
No.
Chair,
they're acting as the council's expert.
Yeah, but not as arbitrator. Just want to make that plain.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Chair, Steve Parish, if I may, we've got. Yeah. Just checking I'm right on this, and I may well not be. We've taken all sorts of advice. We've got PricewaterhouseCoopers involved. There's a possibility that we ask Grant Thornton to do something else, but obviously the more people you ask, the more different views you're likely to get. If in the end Grant Thornton had to issue a qualifier to the accounts, is there any serious impact on that, or is it just something we'd say, well, we accept that because otherwise we're going to spend a lot more time just dragging the whole thing out? I think I'm asking Linton about the impact of a qualified accounts.
Yeah, for me, it'd be very serious if they had to qualify our accounts, and perhaps for Warrington, more serious than for a number of authorities, given that we have a public credit rating. It could have a serious impact on us being able to go to the markets to borrow money through bonds, and have a very negative impact on our credit rating. We don't want to get there, and I don't believe we will get there. We just need to come to an agreement on this particular issue. And as I say, I still don't believe it's material, but let's let PwC do their piece of work. If it's different, and if Grant Thornton don't agree with it, it may well be that I just then say, well, we then agree with Grant Thornton's approach, because at the end of the day, it doesn't really make much odds in our accounts in 17-18, because it undoes itself as part of the further investment into later years anyway. But we do have to get 17-18 correct.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Anything more on Andrew's report? Okay, thanks, Andrew. We go on to the final item, which is the work programme. Has anybody got any comments about the work programme? You will be getting notice. I think February the 16th is the first of many proposed training programmes that we've deferred pending elections. But as we discussed earlier in the week, we don't know when the elections are going to be, so we'll just have to proceed as planned and just put it behind us and just ignore the fact the elections may or may not take place and just proceed as we can. And then hopefully we'll be, so to speak, training the trainers. That we will give them the questions that excite us, so to speak, and then they can use that for when the next council is convened. Otherwise, nothing would get done at all. So are there any comments on the work programme? Any additions that people would like to make?
No.
Then thank you, members and officers. Our work here is done. I bid you all good night.
Thank you very much. Good night.